"Get up, you piece of trash." The shout tore through the midday stillness, followed by the sound of a boot kicking hard into gardening tools scattered on the grass. Cole Werrick, a patrol officer in Glenwood, bent down close to the face of the woman trimming the plants, his breath reeking of cigarettes and rotting authority. He yanked her hair back, his knee pressing into her cheek like he wanted to leave the print of his boot on the dignity of an innocent black woman. Cole thought he was teaching a lesson, but he didn't know that his knee had accidentally pressed against a data-transmitting device hidden under Lena's collar. And in the moment he spat out the words, "You people need to remember your place," her eyes turned cold, the kind of cold that meant she was done pretending. Because Lena wasn't a park employee. She was an undercover FBI agent, tracking Glenwood's own precinct, a place where records were altered, black people disappeared, and power was bought with protection money. Cole's actions were just the first crack in a system beginning to expose itself. When the federal team kicked down the doors, he finally realized he hadn't been pinning down a victim. He'd been pinning down justice, which had just recorded every second of his crime. And from there, a small incident in a park turned into an earthquake that unearthed the secrets of an entire town. What do you think about someone who wears a badge just to stomp on the people? Leave your thoughts and keep watching, because the truth will hit harder than you expect. At midday, the sun in Glenwood was so harsh that the pavement shimmered with a thin, trembling haze. Lena Ridge crouched beneath a maple tree by the path, trimming dead branches that had fallen earlier that morning. The sound of her clippers snipping through dry twigs was steady and sharp, not loud, but enough to make a few passers-by glance over, as if the noise bothered them. An older woman walking her dog gave a quick glare, her face tightening for a moment before she turned away with a soft huff that clearly meant this park wasn't a place where those people should be around at noon. Lena bent down to pick up the trash bag, her movements slow but firm, sinking her breath to keep her expression neutral under those stares that buzzed around like flies in the heat. A few steps away, two young men came over from the running track, their athletic shirts still damp with sweat. One turned to look her over from head to toe, then said to his friend with a half-smirk, half-sneer, "Wrong park for her, man." His friend burst out laughing, a dry, sharp sound that matched the brittle heat cracking the air. Lena didn't respond. She reached down, gathered more golden leaves, and tied the trash bag closed. A breath pushed down into her gut from frustration, then released no point wasting energy on forgettable muttering. What stood out more was the difference between the $1,000 running shoes pounding over polished stone paths and the people sitting quietly in the shade nearby, clutching old water bottles and avoiding eye contact. Glenwood had long been a place where the wealthy followed their own paths. The poor stayed on their own edges, and people like Lena stood somewhere in the middle, not belonging to either. As she fastened the hose and adjusted the trash bag at the tree's base, a chill crept down her back. Not wind, an unseen gaze, from the right. Lena didn't turn her head, just flicked her eyes over, like someone trained to stay aware of her work's surroundings. Beneath the oak tree, an officer stood still, his hand resting on his belt, his broad frame blocking part of the sun behind him. He didn't move closer, didn't speak, just watched. It was the kind of heavy, worn-out look that came from someone who saw another person's presence as a personal inconvenience. Lena tried to secure another bag, but it was hard not to notice that look. She'd seen it before. Plenty of times. The kind of look that gives orders before the mouth even opens. The officer curled one side of his lip, tipped his chin in a mock greeting, then dropped a sentence that landed like stone on concrete. "You people are never in the right place at the right time." His voice was dry, with no subject, no context, just a statement, reminding her he had the authority to judge anyone. An elderly couple walking by paused for half a second, then avoided his eyes like dodging something they didn't want to get involved in. Lena set her clippers down, straightened up, but didn't meet his eyes for long. The sunlight between them was so bright, she had to squint. She bent to pick up another bag, pulling its opening closed. A small action, but necessary to keep her hands from shaking with anger. This wasn't the first time she'd heard that kind of tone. Glenwood had a long list of lines like that, tossed at park workers, drivers, delivery people, anyone who didn't look like they belonged to the town's dominant group. She knew it, had encountered it 1,000 times. But today, the officer's gaze clung to her back, like it was trying to pin down every move she made. Lena took a deep breath, then reached for the collar of her shirt, adjusting the left side button. The movement looked like someone tugging fabric away from their neck in the heat. But her fingers touched a familiar seam, something only she would recognize. A light tap, not lingering, just a habit formed during missions that required calm under pressure. She smoothed the collar back down, then bent to gather more leaves like nothing had happened. The officer still stood there, eyes fixed on her even as the sun started to burn directly across his face. He shifted his belt, slid the radio to one side, and crossed his arms. From the tilt of his head, it wasn't hard to read what was running through his mind. This one's from the lower class. This one doesn't listen. This one needs to be put in her place. A little boy ran past, tugged his mother's hand, and asked, "Mom, why is he staring like that?" But his mom just shook her head and walked faster, not wanting to answer. Lena stood up, lifted the tied bag, and carried it to the main bin at the center of the path. The sun was high, casting broken lines of light across the pavement. Her shadow and his crossed each other like two gray scars. The heat wasn't just from the sun now, it radiated from something closing in. It was a familiar feeling, but one that signaled something different this time. She walked back to her spot, fingers brushing her collar once more, like checking whether the stitching was still in place. In the distance, the officer pushed off the tree and took a few slow steps toward her, face unreadable. But his stare was enough to make nearby people quietly get up and leave. Lena inhaled, keeping her breath steady, like preparing for a routine inspection, but she knew better. In Glenwood, the heat didn't usually come from the sun, and the silence just before the wind changed direction was sometimes the first warning sign of something much bigger. Heavy footsteps slammed against the blistering pavement, like a warning that trouble was headed straight for Lena. She had just set down a freshly collected trash bag when a man's voice rang out from the end of the walkway, loud and cutting like a siren, screeching offbeat at noon. "Hey, girl in the blue shirt, who the hell said you could be in this area?" A few nearby pedestrians flinched, some turned to look, then quickly walked faster, as if pushed away by a wave of heat and discomfort. Lena stood up straight, turning toward the voice. Sergeant Cole Warwick was approaching, with the strange swagger of someone used to being more important than everyone else. Broad shoulders, stomach slightly pushed forward from a habit of posing with authority, eyes narrowed into two slits, locked directly on her like a weapon. Cole didn't stop at a respectful distance. He came in close enough that the bitter smell of coffee on his breath hit Lena full in the face. He leaned in just enough for his shadow to block the sunlight from reaching her. The way he looked at her was the way someone looks when they're amused to find prey in the wrong territory. "What are you doing here? Who assigned this? Who signed off?" His voice was blunt, dry, and each word dropped like a stone in water. Lena took a shallow breath, keeping her voice as low as possible. "I'm with the park's greenery crew, scheduled to trim this area this morning. I just started a few—" "Cut the crap," Cole snapped, waving his hand dismissively with obvious contempt. "You people always have a story ready to make it sound clean. This is a restricted zone. You didn't see the sign, or you were just pretending not to?" He jerked his chin toward a sign about 15 feet away. Weathered, faded, the text so worn it was barely legible to anyone passing by. Cole spoke as if Lena had broken the rules on purpose, just to stir things up. Lena tried to keep her breathing steady, and replied softly, "I'm following the task list for this morning. I already submitted a report. If you need, I can give you the name of my supervisor. You think I've got time to stand here listening to your useless paperwork?" Cole stepped in another half-step, hand drifting to his hip to lightly tug on his radio, like a prop to boost his authority. "Tell me who sent you here. Who told you to work this spot? Or did you just decide on your own because you figured no one would care?" The air around them grew hotter, even though the sun hadn't changed. People in the distance started to notice. A few glanced over, then quickly looked away, like they'd accidentally seen something they shouldn't. A man in a dark button-up shirt paused for a few seconds, but when Cole looked his way, the man dropped his head and tugged a child beside him forward. Glenwood had seen this kind of thing enough that people learned to look away early. Cole's eyes dropped to Lena's work tools, clippers, and a trash bag set next to a tree trunk. He bent down, picked up the clippers between two fingers like they were something filthy, and tossed them onto the cement, where they landed with a sharp clatter. Cheap gear, figures. That's exactly what you people are like. Work like this, and we're supposed to believe you know what the hell you're doing. Everyone. Lena bent to pick them up, avoiding eye contact. His stare seemed to be waiting for her to react, so he could explode. "I'm just doing my assigned work. There's no violation. If you need to verify, you can call the Parks Department." Cole gave a dry laugh. "Call? So they can cover for you? In this town, I can tell what kind of person someone is just by looking. You're the type that starts trouble. All day organizing, and still nothing to show for it." He spoke slowly, dragging out the last word like a dare. Lena slowly placed the clippers into her tool pouch, her movements neat, light, and precise. The tendon on her wrist showed as she gave it a small squeeze, not out of fear, but to keep her expression from shifting under the steady wave of insults. She opened her mouth, about to explain further, but Cole cut her off. "Stand up straight. When I talk, you stand up straight. Even." She stood upright, both hands gripping the bag strap in front of her stomach. The sun pounded down on her shoulders, making her back feel warm, but it was nothing compared to the eyes fixed on her. Cole stepped partially around her, glancing from her hair down to her shoes, like he was assessing something ready to be thrown out. "Look around you. Anyone else here like you? Think about it. Why do you stand out so much? Because you don't belong here. Got it?" A couple out for a walk paused for a few seconds when they heard that. The husband looked like he was about to speak, but his wife tugged his arm, gave a small shake of her head, and pulled him away. The woman avoided Lena's eyes, as if she wanted no part in anything involving the town's police. Cole leaned in closer to Lena's face. "I'll ask one last time. Who told you you could be here?" Lena kept her voice low, almost a whisper, but clear enough for him to hear. "The schedule was sent already. I was assigned this area. I'm doing my part." Cole let out a short hiss through his teeth. "You've got the nerve to talk back. A temp worker standing here talking back to me." He reached out to yank the name badge on Lena's shirt to get a better look, but stopped halfway and instead shoved her equipment aside in frustration. Lena stepped back just enough to avoid his arm hitting her face, quick but controlled. Cole kept staring like he was deciding whether to escalate the situation. A group of young people walked by and glanced at the scene, their faces paling a bit. One of them muttered, "Not getting involved," and they all picked up their pace, leaving a heavy silence between Lena and Cole. Lena adjusted the strap of her hip pouch, then absent-mindedly brought her hand to her collar and smoothed it down. No one noticed it was something she always did when trying to steady her breathing. Cole saw the gesture, but mistook it for defiance, and snapped, "Look closely. I'm here to clean up garbage like this. You're one of them." Lena looked him straight in the eye for the first time since he arrived. Her gaze was steady, unshaken. Cole paused for a beat, surprised her face didn't show the fear he was used to seeing when yelling at people in broad daylight. But the moment passed quickly, and he jerked his chin upward, voice sharp like a hammer strike. "You people always pick the nice spots to pretend you're working." His voice carried clear disdain, the kind that comes from someone used to judging others at first glance. Lena shifted slightly to pick up the last trash bag when Cole thrust his hand toward her face, his fingertip no more than a handspan from the bridge of her nose. He didn't shout, his voice was low and heavy, like a threat. "I'm talking to you. Listen carefully." A middle-aged jogger passing by saw the scene, paused for half a second, but when Cole glanced his way, the man immediately lowered his head and kept running. Lena set the bag down, angling her shoulders slightly to move away from the finger pointed at her. Cole misread the motion, assuming it was defiance, and barked louder. "What do you think you're doing? Who said you could turn your back when I'm talking?" Lena kept her breath slow and steady, then answered quietly, like offering an explanation. "I'm grouping the trash bags together to tidy up. You told me to clean up, and I'm doing that. You're doing it because I'm standing here." Cole leaned in closer, breath hot, with the bitter smell of coffee blowing straight into her face. "Not because you know how to do things right." He straightened up, eyes dropping to her dirt-smudged work gloves, lips curling like what he saw was beneath him. "You people always act busy. When I show up, heads down. As soon as I leave, back to being lazy." An elderly woman walking her grandchild past them picked up her pace. When the child whispered, "Did she do something wrong, Grandma?" the woman quietly replied, "Don't look. Keep walking." That moment brushed past the corner of Lena's eye, tightening something in her chest, though her face stayed calm. Cole saw the exchange and seemed to puff up even more, as if other people's fear confirmed his place in the world. He raised his hand again, this time pointing directly at Lena's forehead, voice thick with irritation. "Let me tell you something. We can run you out of this town anytime we want. From morning to night, it's always people like you, stirring up trouble. Everything turns into a problem when you're around." The words dropped like a boulder into the heat-thick air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by, though they all quickly slipped away, unwilling to be caught between such an uneven power dynamic. Lena lifted her tool bag and dipped her head just slightly. When she looked up again, her gaze didn't dodge like before. It had sharpened clearer, deeper, and so calm it made him pause. Just a fraction of a second. Not harsh, just steady. And something in it didn't match the story he'd already written about her. He tilted his head, hunting for some sign of defiance to push back against. A kid holding a soda can stood at a distance, not understanding what was happening, but sensing the silence between the two adults. He swallowed and ran back toward his parents. Lena shifted her eyes not to avoid Cole, but for another reason entirely. She scanned 3 spots above them where 3 park cameras were mounted. One beside an old lamppost, another near the bike rental station, and one behind a flower bed, looking toward her angle. Her eyes passed each one just once, almost unconsciously, leaving no clear trace. Cole didn't notice. He was too busy leaning in, trying to tower over her. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Stop looking around. Stay right here." His voice dropped from above like a heavy weight. Lena stopped what she was doing and turned back to face him, showing no hint of fear. That only irritated Cole more. His tone turned harsher. "You hear me?" I said. "Stay put," Lena replied calmly, voice soft but firm. "I'm still standing here." The answer wasn't defiant, wasn't submissive. It was simply a statement. But that steadiness irked Cole more than any argument would have. He stepped in another half-step, closing the gap. "Don't think I don't know your type, standing still but scheming in your head. Thinking I'm easy to outsmart." Lena didn't flinch. Her gaze held steady, neither bowed nor confrontational. Cole raised his hand again, this time lowering it toward her chin, close enough that a slight move would make contact. He growled each word. "This is our town. If you live here, know your place." A young man walking by on a phone call saw the scene and froze. Then lowered his phone, gave up on intervening, and took another path. That kind of atmosphere spread like fine dust on hot pavement, clinging to every step, keeping people from getting involved. Lena tilted her head slightly to move her chin out of the line of his finger, then bent to her tool bag, not to back down, but to prevent the moment from escalating. She gathered her things not slowly, not rushed. Every move was even, tidy, and practiced. As she stood, her eyes once again flicked toward the third camera at the far end of the path. Cole followed her gaze but assumed she was looking for help. He let out a short, mocking laugh. "Pointless. No one here's gonna help you. When they see you, it's like seeing a bench, nobody gives a damn." Lena turned back to him, voice gentle. "I'm not looking for anyone." Lena bent down to pick up the clippers that had just fallen from her tool bag. She was about to reach lower for the metal handle when Cole suddenly lunged from behind, his heavy, rough hand grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking it hard. The pull snapped her neck back, her gaze shooting straight into the glaring sky, blinding white spots flooding her vision. Her back twisted, throwing her feet off the pavement, her whole body thrown off balance. A sharp, dry breath caught in her throat, more from shock than pain. Cole didn't give her a moment to recover. He used his arm to shove her down, forcing her off balance until she collapsed forward, her knees slamming into the burning cement. Before Lena could catch her breath, Cole drove his knee down onto her face. The sudden pressure smashed her chin against the ground, the heat of the cement searing her skin, sharp with the smell of dust. Her breath hitched. Every attempt to inhale met with a weight crushing her temple and cheekbone. Cole pressed down harder, shifting his foot to increase the pressure, forcing her face even closer to the pavement. The heat and the pounding of her heartbeat merged into a single searing rhythm, while the man's voice above her cut through everything else. "You should be grateful I haven't crushed your face." His tone was acidic, each word landing like another blow to the back of her neck. He said it like someone used to describing something they'd done many times, without restraint. People walking by dropped their eyes and rushed past. A few turned away completely, afraid of getting involved. A young woman pushing a stroller stopped when she saw Cole pinning Lena down. But the moment Cole's gaze flicked toward her, she turned the stroller and walked away without looking back. They avoided his eyes like witnesses avoiding a car crash they didn't want to testify to. Cole shoved his knee in deeper, throwing in another line, louder now, knowing no one would dare intervene. "You all think you can go wherever you want. But if I say so, no one in this whole park would lift a finger for you." He shifted his weight onto his left leg, grinding half of Lena's face into the coarse concrete. A puff of fine dust burst into the corner of her eye, stinging her vision but not making her close it. She released her breath slowly, using it to steady herself. A man in his 50s paused across the walkway, watching for about a second before pulling the brim of his cap down. He turned away, but not before casting one last helpless glance. Two younger people sitting on a nearby bench immediately stood up. Each held a phone, but after seeing the badge on Cole's shoulder, both lowered their hands and put the phones away. They turned and walked off faster than normal, like slipping back into Glenwood's old habit. Avoid anything involving the police, especially police like Cole. Lena's face was pressed against the pavement, forcing her to tilt her head just to breathe. She didn't fight back, didn't brace against the weight. Her lips touched the scorching cement, burning hot against her skin, and her breath broke in her throat. But the eyes that looked up from the side, those were not the eyes of someone weak. They weren't squinting, weren't trembling. They were clear and cold, like steel. If Cole had looked down closely, he might have seen that the expression didn't belong to someone dazed or scared. But Cole didn't see it. He was too caught up in the thrill of his knee holding down power. "You hear me? I'm talking to you. Got nothing to do but act like you're useful." He grabbed another fistful of Lena's hair, yanking it up again, pain searing across her scalp. A faint hiss slipped through his clenched teeth, like he was delivering a lesson. "When I lift my knee, you should be thankful. I'm doing my job here." A group of students walked by. The girl at the very end stopped short when she saw Lena being forced to the ground. She started to step forward, but a friend tugged her arm and whispered something, maybe, "Let's go," or "Don't get involved." The girl turned away, but fear still lingered on her face. Every look before turning away said the same thing. They knew what was happening was wrong, but they also knew Cole Warwick was the kind of man no one in town dared to go up against. Lena tried to turn her face slightly to one side for more air, her eyes slowly opening and locking onto a spot above, where a gap broke between the tree branches and the sky. Her gaze sharpened, not out of anger, but because she was recording everything in her own way. Cole didn't notice the difference in her focus, or that she was calculating the distance, the angles, the volume of his voice, and the exact moment he used force. Cole held his grip for a few more seconds, then suddenly pulled his hand away from Lena's hair, stood up straight, and took a step back. He brushed off both hands as he'd just cleaned up some mess. "Get up! Stay down there acting like that, and I'll handle it another way." Lena turned slowly, pressed her hands to the hot pavement, and pushed herself upright. Red marks still streaked her face from the pressure of his knee. She tilted her head to one side and brushed the dust off her cheek, her eyes just as cold as they were when she was forced to the ground. Once she was steady, Cole gave her a quick once-over, as if checking whether she was about to talk back. She said nothing, just stood still, one hand smoothing out the tangled hair behind her. But the way she looked him in the eye this time made him pause for half a breath. There was something in her gaze that didn't match the image of a park worker beaten down into silence. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Cole turned away, but the feeling of being seen through, of being judged in return, clung to his back as he walked a few steps off. Lena stayed where she was, took a deep breath, then picked up the clippers lying nearby, her hand giving them one tight squeeze before letting go. Her final glance shifted to the camera post facing the main path, then back to the unfinished task in front of her, as if the violent encounter had only been a small part of something much larger, still waiting ahead. Cole stepped back, just as Lena was still brushing dust off her hands. He didn't give her a chance to catch her breath. He grabbed her arm roughly, twisted it behind her back, and snapped a cold metal cuff onto her wrist, with enough force that the sound of it clamping down on skin rang out clearly. "Don't look at me like that. I know your type." Lena kept her chin up, letting both wrists be yanked back without showing any change in her breathing. Her silence made Cole think he'd cornered her, and that only made him want to push further. He jerked the handcuffs hard, dragging Lena across the concrete path, like hauling off a broken object not worth handling with care. Each of his steps punched into the ground, and everyone around did what they always did. In a town like Glenwood, steered off course, avoided eye contact, avoided becoming the one questioned right there on the street. An ice cream vendor pushing his cart glanced over, the flicker of discomfort in his eyes vanishing the moment Cole looked his way. Lena took it all in with a direct gaze, every word Cole threw like stones into a deep well inside her mind. "I'm telling you, I don't even know why you people keep hanging around this park." Cole shoved Lena's shoulder with his solid arm, causing her to stumble for a step before she regained her balance. "In this place, we have to clear out all the trouble to keep things clean for the people who matter. You think you're important? You're just trouble dressed up like work." His voice rose as people continued to avoid him. Em and Lena kept offering no response. Lena tilted her head slightly, sidestepping the rough edge of the ramp as they reached the main road. Her silence wasn't submission. It was more like space being left open to record even more. Cole took it another way. He scoffed and leaned in closer to her face. I know what you're thinking. Thinking if you just stay quiet, this'll pass. But I'm telling you, I don't forget faces like yours. What it's 7. He finished the sentence and shoved her hard against the patrol car, one side of her body striking the hot metal, the heat burning into her shoulder blade. He opened the car door, yanking her cuffed wrists higher until the stretch in her shoulders sent a jolt of pain up her spine. Get in! His voice treated her like an animal. Lena lifted a foot, stepped onto the doorframe, ducking her head to avoid hitting the roof. But before she sat down, Cole couldn't resist throwing in a few more words to stamp his authority. This town's tired of people like you. Do a little work and act like you deserve something? I've seen your type plenty. Always ends the same, making noise, playing victim. But here in Glenwood, we know how to clean that up. He shoved her head down onto the back seat cushion, one hand holding the door ready to slam it shut. The air inside the car was cramped and hot, the smell of plastic from the seat pressing against her face. Lena looked through the window and saw Cole's shadow stretch across the pavement as he stood back up, hands on his hips, posture saying he thought this was just another afternoon spent teaching someone a lesson. She sat still, wrists pulled tight behind her, shoulders aching. She leaned her head slightly to the right to avoid the sharp glare of sunlight cutting through the window just as Cole opened the door again, leaning in for one last line. Let me tell you something, I specialize in people who think they're clean. You should be grateful, all I did was cuff you. Lena looked at him, her expression unchanged, voice low, and even like stating a fact. The way you look at me, I already know what kind of man you are. Do have. The words were short, sharp, and struck right at something Cole didn't want named. He paused, eyes narrowing, then slammed the door so hard the whole frame shook. The anger was plain on his face, surprised that the only thing she said had landed where it hurt. Inside the car, Lena sat still for a few seconds, eyes forward, as if studying the reaction of the man who had just shoved her in. Cole circled to the driver's seat, opened the door, sat down, and adjusted his seatbelt like everything was normal. But behind him, just a moment earlier, a faint click had sounded from Lena's collar. Clean, sharp, soft enough that an ordinary ear would miss it. Lena didn't look down, didn't breathe harder, didn't shift her shoulders at all. She let her head rest back against the seat, eyes watching the road retreat behind them as the car rolled forward. That moment sat quiet between the hum of the engine and the tires crunching over gravel. So quiet, only someone who knew what was hidden in that fold of fabric would understand what had just been activated. Cole stared ahead, mouth half open like he was going to say something, but the irritation from Lena's last words held him in rare silence. And Lena, eyes on the window, just kept recording another part of the world closing in around her inside that patrol car. She didn't need to replay the insults, every shout, every word thrown, every tug of hair, every shove had already landed where it needed to in her memory. And now, a different kind of silence had begun. A silence so exact that anyone paying attention would know it wasn't just submission anymore. The car rolled deeper into the main road, sunlight shifting across the back seat, while the small click from earlier, though barely heard, was now carrying something Cole would never see coming. Cole started the engine, and the car gave a slight jolt before rolling out onto the blazing pavement. After just a few meters, he tilted his head toward the back and tossed out a line without thinking. Cheap trash like you always stirs up trouble. He didn't even bother to turn fully around, as if the words were too routine to need effort. Lena sat in the back seat, hands cuffed on her lap, eyes looking out the window. Her face didn't flinch at the comment, which only encouraged Cole to keep going. I'm telling you, I've seen tons just like you, he said, voice flat like he was reading a script he'd memorized long ago. Wandering into places you're not supposed to be, then acting surprised when you get caught, Like you're squeaky clean. People like you live in this town, and we have to double up just to keep order." Through the rearview mirror, he glanced at the two officers in the patrol car behind them, giving a slight nod for backup. The two cops, one younger in the passenger seat, the other older behind the wheel, burst out laughing, like they were hearing the most ordinary story. "Right on, Sarge. These troublemakers? Just cuff 'em right away," said the younger one, voice casual like he was talking about something half asleep. The older one added, "Wherever they go, they're a pain." Their tone made it clear they didn't care that the person in the back seat was hearing every word. Cole looked at Lena in the mirror and saw she was still quiet. "Do you even know how much trouble you cause? All you had to do was trim some grass, and still you made a mess. I even got a fresh report here. Want to hear it?" Without waiting for an answer, he launched into a mock official voice, the kind meant to sound like courtroom authority. Charge 1. Interfering with a law enforcement officer. Charge 2. Willfully creating a safety hazard in a public space. Charge 3. Failure to comply with park security protocol. He hit each line like he was pinning the charges down, making sure they stuck before reaching the precinct. Lena kept her head leaned against the window, letting the light streak across her face in broken patterns. His voice struck her ears rhythmically, but stirred no emotion. Cole tilted his head farther, still watching her, trying to find the reaction he wanted. "You hear all that? I'm reading your charges. Or you think we're just messing around?" Lena responded in a calm, even voice. "You're going to want to remember everything you said today." Cole hesitated at the wheel for a brief second. "What's that supposed to mean? You threatening me now?" He laughed, as he'd just heard a joke. "Who do you think you are, talking like that? A temp worker daring to threaten a cop?" He shook his head and glanced again toward his buddy in the car behind them, looking for a nod of agreement. That man laughed along, slapping the steering wheel like cheering on Cole's point. The car turned onto a street. Lena knew well the road that led to the Glenwood precinct. It passed through 3 checkpoints, 2 side streets, and 1 intersection where a traffic camera had been installed last year. Lena's eyes moved past the 2 tall buildings, now shrinking in the rear view. She took in every turn the car made, each bend, every camera position scanning over the roof. She had studied this route on late nights before, but today, riding it in real time meant something entirely different. Cole kept rambling the same lines everyone in Glenwood had heard too many times. "If we didn't clean up this town, people like you would turn it into a damn mess. You do some tiny job and still try to act important." His voice was sharp but oddly cheerful, like someone who'd finally found a target to unload a whole day's frustration on. "The quiet ones, the statue types think people respect them. I'm telling you. It's always the silent ones that stir up trouble." Lena glanced into the rearview mirror and caught Cole's eyes for exactly 1 second. He saw the look and squinted. She didn't seem angry or scared. It bothered him it didn't fit the image he wanted to see. He planted a hand on the steering wheel and switched to a heavier tone. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Don't look at me like that. I know you hate me. But I'm the one who decides what happens to you tonight." She answered with something else, soft and clear. "You should watch how you talk. You might need to remember later." The reply made the air in the car go still for a beat. Cole looked at her in the mirror again, his face as if he'd just heard something that didn't belong in this moment. He took a sharp breath. "You think I'm scared of that vague crap? I've handled hundreds like you." Lena leaned her head deeper against the window. The outside light flickered across her cheek in scattered streaks. Her steady breathing was the opposite of Cole's rising anger. For a few seconds, the only sounds in the car were the engine idling and wind sliding through the cracked window. But beneath that quiet, each of Cole's harsh words was being marked, timed perfectly into place. The car turned onto a narrow road, leading to the precinct. Lena stayed calm, watching the route as if this were her first time being driven there, even though she remembered every security camera posted along the way. Cole didn't notice anything. Off? He was too busy finishing his last few lines as the car rolled to a stop. "We're here. Get out. Just know this, no one's siding with you. Around here, what we say goes." Lena looked again toward the row of buildings, noting that the vehicle followed exactly the route she'd memorized before. There was a subtle shift in her eyes as the precinct sign came into view. Not worry, not confusion, just a flicker of recognition, enough to confirm that everything had unfolded exactly the way she'd planned for. Cole stepped out and slammed the door shut. Lena closed her eyes for one brief second, then opened them, reaching for the handle to exit. And in that moment, a small click sounded at her collar, just as the sunlight hit the edge of her shirt. No one heard it except someone who knew exactly where that signal was headed. Cole yanked the car door open with such force that the hinge let out a sharp warning creak. He grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her out of the back seat without easing up, causing her knee to smack the edge of the metal door before she could set her foot on the ground. The Glenwood precinct stood in front of them, a weathered two-story building with peeling paint, but the kind of place where power hung so heavy that people crossing by avoided even looking at it. Cole shoved Lena across the parking lot, every step radiating the smugness of someone convinced he had just caught something his co-workers would enjoy watching. He pulled open the precinct's main door, one hand gripping Lena's cuffs tight as he pushed her into the long hallway. Cold air from the air conditioning hit her face, but it didn't lighten the air one bit. Every gaze along the hallway turned toward them immediately. A desk officer lifted his head, squinting before letting out a laugh at the sight of Lena being dragged in. "Back early, Sarge. Just stepped out and already caught something fun?" Another leaned against the wall inside, coffee in hand, grimacing with mockery. "Don't even need to ask, she looks like trouble." The words came out as naturally as breathing. No one bothered to hide their disdain. Lena was pushed along, her steps off kilter as Cole kept yanking the cuffs forward to make her move faster. The hallway was narrow, lined with frosted glass office doors, shadows of people shifting inside. A few officers looked over like watching a mid-shift show. One mumbled, "Another one thinking she's useful." Someone replied, "Let's see how tough she still is by tonight." The whispers drifted past Lena's ears, more like noise she recorded than something she reacted to. Cole fed off the growing attention, energized by their approval. At the hallway junction, he yanked Lena sharply to the right, spinning her like a wooden figure. She nearly tripped on the step, but steadied herself before her shoulder could hit the wall. Her eyes flicked over every inch of the space she entered. From the outdated bulletin board to the camera near the ceiling, every detail filed away like a separate data set in her mind. Cole stopped when a figure appeared at the far end, stepping out of the command room. Captain Rourke emerged, cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't need to. One glance at the cuffs on Lena's wrists, then at her face, was enough. He looked at her like one looks through a dirty window at something unimportant. He walked slowly, heels striking the floor so firmly that the sound itself became a silent order for the other officers to step aside. Cole straightened up, like he was showing off his prize. "Caught her in a restricted zone, Captain. Disobedient, disruptive, mouthy." He listed the offenses like inventory from a victory hall. A few officers nodded. One let out a low whistle. Rourke stopped in front of Lena, his eyes cold, scanning her face like weighing whether she was worth anything beyond a holding cell. He raised the cigarette, took a drag, then flicked the ash directly in front of Lena's boot. The glowing bit hit the floor in a tiny spark, right near her toe. He exhaled slowly, his voice flat like reading a caption. "In Glenwood, we decide who's right and who's wrong." That line made Cole even prouder. He turned to Lena with a look that said she was on his turf now. A younger officer farther down chuckled, hand half covering his mouth, but not hiding the laugh. The group behind Rourke quieted, as if waiting for the captain's verdict to seal the moment. Lena stood straight, hands still pulled back. She met Rourke's gaze, didn't flinch, didn't soften. Her eyes were steady and clear enough for Rourke to notice something didn't fit. She wasn't like the usual faces brought in here week after week. He squinted for a split second, but the doubt passed quickly. He waved his hand. "Book her! No marks!" The words dropped softly but heavily, the kind of order that could cover any action in this place. Cole nodded immediately. Got it. He gripped the cuffs again and pulled Lena toward the stairs leading to the holding cells. An older officer standing nearby shook his head. Probably another one who thinks she's special. Two others laughed, their eyes sharp with the kind of cruel amusement Lena had seen hundreds of times in towns that ran like Glenwood. As Cole dragged her down the steps, the air thickened and the light dimmed. Lena placed each step carefully, keeping her balance, head slightly down to avoid slipping. At the bottom step, Cole turned toward her again, ready to toss one more insult to cap off the performance. But before he could open his mouth, Lena lifted her head. Her eyes locked onto his, and her voice came out low and clean, like a blade freshly sharpened. "Well, today's going to be interesting." Cole raised an eyebrow for a split second, unsure whether it was a threat or sarcasm. He tightened his grip on the cuffs and pulled her down the final stretch of the hallway. But the triumphant grin he had worn minutes earlier was no longer intact. Lena followed, her eyes holding just enough cold to make it clear that everything from the park to this staircase was already part of a current she'd seen coming long before they had. The holding cell door closed behind Cole with a deep, even clang, the kind of sound that felt like the whole detention block was exhaling. Lena sat on the cold concrete bench, hands still cuffed in front of her. She tilted her head slightly to ease the stiffness in her neck, eyes fixed on the dim corner of the room where a yellow bulb hung from the ceiling. She hadn't yet steadied her breathing when Cole's footsteps echoed back, sharp and deliberate, as if he wanted her to know he was coming. He stood in the doorway, watching her like a man picking up where he left off in a movie he wasn't finished enjoying. Cole shut the door more slowly than usual, walked over, and gave the bench a light kick before crouching down to eye level. He was close enough that his breath, smelling of cigarettes and coffee, washed across her face. "Who do you think you are?" His voice was low, but cutting. The tone of someone used to putting people in their place. Lena lifted her head just enough to look at him, her expression unchanged. She didn't flinch. She didn't challenge. She just looked. One long breath passed. Cole narrowed his eyes, a thin smile curling up. He mistook that gaze for resistance, and resistance was his favorite thing, because it gave him an excuse to go further. "You know what I could do with this?" Cole stroked his chin, dragging out each word like he was telling a good joke. "I could tell the local paper you attacked me, said you were a threat in the park. They love stories like that around here, the more dramatic, the better. Tomorrow, your face will be on the front page with the headline, 'Park Worker Assaults Officer.' The whole town would know your name." He laughed dryly, as he could already see it. Lena didn't move. Her fingers curled slightly inside the cuffs, but didn't shake. She tilted her head to one side so the overhead light hit Cole's face. He took that as encouragement. "You think anyone's gonna defend you?" he said. "Within 5 minutes, the entire town council would back us. Someone like you? Perfect target." He braced one arm on his knee, raising the other to her face. His hand opened, fingers slightly curled, as if preparing to slap her. "You should learn to keep quiet and thank me before I decide not to end this the easy way." The heat from his palm passed across her face, turning the air into something thick and solid. He started to lower his hand. "One shot, and you'll know I'm not kidding." Lena held her gaze. She didn't jerk away. She didn't shrink back. That calm froze Cole's hand for a second, And then he gritted his teeth. Trying to look tough? Want to see how far I'll go? She spoke for the first time, her voice so soft and smooth that Cole had to lean in to hear her clearly. You're filming yourself right now. His hand stopped completely. Not down, not withdrawn, just paused. What? Cole's brows pulled together, his breath catching for half a second. He glanced around the room, but it was small, barely 10 square meters, empty except for the yellow light and the metal door. No phone, no obvious recording device, nothing that would make him feel watched. What the hell do you mean? He snapped. Lena looked up at the ceiling for a brief moment, then returned her gaze to Cole. Her voice was calm, steady, and low. You're leaving evidence yourself. You should check your position. Cole sprang up, hands braced on his knees, and looked straight toward the ceiling corner. Up there was a mounted camera, the kind he believed had been dead for a long time, because the finance department refused to fund replacements. He scoffed. That camera's dead, just sitting there for show. Don't try anything. Lena said nothing more. She just shifted her wrist inside the cuffs, a small motion, as if adjusting to ease the numbness. But her silence made Cole glance up at the camera again, as if he needed to reassure himself of what he'd just said. The holding room was so quiet that footsteps from the hallway echoed in. Cole glanced down at Lena, saw that her eyes were still calm, no sign of guilt or fear. Don't think you're smarter than me, he said, but his voice was lower now, almost like he was speaking to himself. He leaned in again, face close to hers for the second time. We run this place. Lena raised her face, narrowing her eyes slightly like she was gauging a change in the light. I think today you're answering that question for yourself. Cole straightened up, his eyes flicking briefly around the room. A faint unease crept along the back of his neck, not because he feared being recorded, but because Lena's face showed none of the panic or cornered resistance he expected. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was the stillness of someone waiting for the last piece to click into place. He waved a hand. Sit there all you want. Let's see how long you stay sharp. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door harder than when he came in. But just before he fully stepped out, Cole glanced up at the camera one more time and muttered a curse, something he rarely did when he was certain of his power. As the door closed, the holding room fell into the faint hum of the overhead light. Lena sat still, eyes fixed on the ceiling corner. That camera was indeed working. Not Glenwood's, but one secretly installed 2 months earlier by a unit investigating abuses of power within the town's police force. No one was nearby, but a faint recording light glowed, barely visible unless you were sitting at just the right angle. Lena didn't smile, didn't breathe heavy, didn't shift her expression. She only tilted her head slightly, as if confirming the next step in a plan that had just entered a critical phase. Cole thought he was there to teach a second lesson. But in truth, it was the first time he walked straight into the center of the evidence he'd created himself. The iron door shut behind Cole, the metal clanging through the cramped space of the holding cell before sinking into a thick silence. Lena remained seated on the concrete bench, wrists still cuffed, but her shoulders were more relaxed than when she'd been dragged down. A narrow beam of light from the yellow bulb overhead fell across her face, highlighting the layer of dust on her cheek from the earlier takedown. She tilted her head slightly, almost an unconscious motion, as if recalibrating the situation before taking her next step. Lena glanced toward the cell door, where light from the hallway filtered through a small slot. Footsteps echoed intermittently outside, steady in the way only someone familiar with the building would walk. Cole was moving farther away, saying something to someone beyond the walls. But his voice, fractured by the thick brick, only the slow churn of the ceiling vent remained. In that space that seemed empty, Lena lifted her chin just a little, her thumb brushing the seam inside her collar. A tiny press. But enough. Lena pressed the concealed button, buried in the fabric so small that even someone standing in front of her wouldn't notice her thumb move. When the button bottomed out, there was a soft click, quiet as an ant walking on wood, but just loud enough to trigger the signal. From the edge of what looked like a simple piece of clothing, a stream of data was sent out, feeding directly into a system she knew better than anyone in Glenwood. The footage from the holding cell's camera, the audio from the conversation with Cole, all of it fed into a transmission line that had been tested dozens of times in other locations. But this was the first time it was activated in Glenwood for its intended target. Out in the hallway, Cole laughed loudly at something, oblivious to the fact that the insults he had just spewed were now being processed somewhere hundreds of miles away. He slapped someone's hand. Then his footsteps faded from the cell block. Inside, Lena remained still, her cuffed hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. She began to count each footstep fading, each voice softening, each clunk of a lock from the desk above, each beat of a building she had spent nearly a year learning by heart. For the past 11 months, Lena had lived in Glenwood like a shadow no one noticed. Trimming trees, sweeping leaves, hauling dirt, doing the kind of work that made people not bother asking your name. But as she counted the steps outside, each sound held meaning. The distance between echoes on the walls told her exactly who was walking, in what direction, and which of the 4 officer groups under investigation they belonged to. She had tracked those details for weeks, long enough to know how many people were on shift today without seeing a single face. 1 second after the collar button was pressed, in a dark room far from Glenwood, a monitor lit up with a green indicator light. A sharp, clear line of text appeared. "The bait has been taken." One of 3 agents seated at the console leaned forward, checking the incoming signal from Glenwood. "Signal confirmed. We're entering the final phase," he said aloud in the low-traffic room, where the server had been assigned to the unit's longest-running operation of the year. Another agent spun his chair, activating 2 more side monitors. "Holding cell camera 7 is streaming. Audio is clean. She's in the right spot. It's not I-dive." In Glenwood, the small holding cell remained soaked in the pale yellow hue of the overhead light. Lena closed her eyes for a beat to release the tension in her face, then opened them again, gaze fixed on the ceiling corner. The camera sat there, hidden beneath a layer of dust deliberately placed to make it look abandoned long ago. But it was recording every second, every movement, every threat Cole had just thrown at her. Locals believed the camera had been dead for 2 years, and the tech department assumed there was no budget for repairs. But 2 months ago, another team had entered through the maintenance route after the night shift and replaced the entire internal system, linking it to a covert transmission line. Lena exhaled slowly, her breath so steady it could have passed for the ordinary fatigue of someone recently detained. But in that moment, agents on the other side were watching her face through a monitor, noting the steadiness in her eyes, the kind only someone with years of training could maintain in a situation like this. One of them spoke quietly, as if confirming the final step had just been triggered. "Agent Ridge is still on protocol." Lena opened her eyes fully, looked down at the cuff on her wrist, then shifted her gaze to the iron door frame. Not to find an escape route, but to track the timing. From now until the intervention team arrived, every minute counted as a month's worth of undercover work. She mentally replayed the sequence of events, every person inside the precinct, every data packet being transmitted, every piece of evidence now captured at a range never achieved before. Her body ached from being slammed and pinned, but that pain was secondary to the larger objective. Meanwhile, Cole stood 2 corners down the hallway, chatting with 2 other officers. His voice was full of self-satisfaction, completely unaware that everything he'd said in the holding cell had just landed on a federal server. He bragged about his takedown, and the other officers whistled and praised like they were hearing a good story. Cole reenacted how he dragged Lena from the park, using his hands to act out each detail like a performance. No one questioned him. No one suspected anything. No one thought anyone might be recording. Lena listened to his voice from a distance. Every word floated into her ears and clicked into place, like pieces of evidence locking into a frame. A minute later, she tilted her head by the smallest degree and felt the faintest vibration along the seam of her collar. The signal that the data had just been uploaded to the surveillance system and had reached the intended hands. A single thought crossed her mind, clean and sharp, like a period at the end of a sentence. 11 months undercover had not been wasted. 11 months as a shadow in the park. 11 months of listening to filth without reacting. All of it led to this precise moment, when Glenwood unknowingly tightened the noose it thought it had control of. She looked at the still air of the cell, let her shoulders drop slightly, then turned her eyes toward the door. This was no longer the time to endure. This was the moment everything shifted. Lena Ridge wasn't a bullied park worker. She was an FBI agent, embedded deep inside Glenwood for 11 months, waiting for exactly this day. The first sound wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a siren. It was the sound of boots hitting concrete in perfect rhythm. Heavy, steady, urgent. The rhythm of people who didn't need introductions, didn't knock, didn't ask permission. Lena heard it from inside the holding cell before the officers in the hallway even realized what was happening. She lifted her head, eyes fixed on the door like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. A slow breath escaped from the corner of her lips. Outside, the shouting began. "Everybody, stay where you are. Hands where we can see them. No one moves." The commands were sharp and loud enough to make the jail walls vibrate. Then the boots shifted from a brisk walk to short, quick bursts of running, followed by the clatter of metal against walls, the snapping of gun bolts, the crackle of radios. One officer at the front desk shouted, "What's going on?" But the question was cut off by the main precinct doors swinging open with the force of a punch. The DOJ team came in first, yellow letters on their backs, weapons held at chest level. Behind them were the FBI, then Internal Affairs. 3 units moving in sync. Like they had rehearsed it dozens of times, though this was the first and only time they had ever done it in Glenwood. One officer stood up too slowly and was slammed face down onto a desk, papers flying everywhere. Another was yanked up from a chair before he could raise his hands. The sound of chairs crashing into walls silenced every other officer in the room. Cole stood in the hallway, his mouth open, but no words coming out. His jaw twitched, eyes wide enough to show the whites. His hands went up instinctively the moment he saw 5 gun barrels aimed at him. One agent barked, "Do not move!" and Cole froze so hard his shoulders trembled. The people in that precinct were used to bullying the powerless, but they had never faced a force big enough to flatten the whole building in under a minute. Lena sat in the cell, watching through the narrow slit in the door. When an agent stepped forward to unlock it, she was already on her feet before he touched the latch. Cold air from the hallway swept in, but her expression stayed calm, almost in contrast to the chaos outside. She held out her hands, voice low and clear. "Uncuff me. No demand, no plea. Just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be." The agent glanced at her for 1 second and instantly knew she wasn't a prisoner. He turned the key, and the cuffs popped open with a clean click. Lena lowered her hands, rolled her wrists to get the blood flowing again, then stepped into the hallway where Cole stood frozen like a statue. A few officers turned pale when they saw her. They were used to treating Lena like a disposable laborer, someone beneath attention. But now, she walked straight down the middle of a line of federal agents, standing tall, no longer needing to keep her eyes on the floor. She walked toward Cole, not fast, not slow. When she reached him, she reached into the chest pocket of her work shirt, pulled out a small, dark blue card, and held it up to his eye level. The card caught the light, revealing the sharp, clear print. Special Agent Lena Ridge. Federal Jurisdiction. 17 Avenidas. The introduction hit the air like a piece of heavy metal. No extra noise, no need for explanation. Cole looked at the badge, then at her face, then back at the badge again, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. His lips moved, but no words came out. Sweat slid down his temple, even though the hallway wasn't hot. A DOJ agent stepped forward and cuffed Cole's hands before he could react. Sergeant Cole Warwick, you are under arrest, under federal investigation. Remain silent. Cole opened his mouth to object, but the agent's hand was already on his shoulder, turning him toward the wall to finish reading his rights. Cole swallowed a sound he normally would have thrown at someone weaker, but now he was wedged between three groups he couldn't intimidate. The Glenwood precinct fell into chaos. Weapons were lowered by protocol. Agents' voices echoed as they read warrants. Multiple officers were ordered to lie down or stand with arms out against the wall. Rourke was pulled out of the command room, hands raised high, his face flushed with rage but too stunned to resist. The fake confidence and power they had used to crush others were now stripped, layer by layer, leaving the building bare under the weight of actual law. In the middle of the chaos, there was one person who showed no fear or surprise. A young officer stood at the far end of the hallway, gripping his radio but not joining the resistance. He looked at Lena for a moment. His eyes showed a flicker of relief he could barely hide. As she passed by, his nod was so small it would have been missed by anyone else. Lena didn't stop, but her eyelids lowered slightly in return, acknowledging the presence of someone who had quietly helped her survive the most dangerous months. The young officer turned away just as an agent approached. But the corner of his mouth lifted in a quick, thin smile. He had waited for this exact moment to see the effort of the one he secretly supported finally crack through Glenwood's rotten shell. Lena stopped in the middle of the hallway, taking in the eruption around her. Handcuffs hit the floor. Reports were collected. Computers were sealed. Officers who once mocked her were being led away. This wasn't revenge. This was justice reclaiming its ground. Lena Ridge, once treated like trash in the park, now stood at the center of the operation, both the bait and the blade. The ones who thought they could stomp her down were now face to face with real law. She tucked the badge away and kept walking, her voice low, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's time to clean up Glenwood. The sound of the seal tape being pressed onto the precinct's main door echoed in heavy layers, like history itself was being shut behind it. A red strip stretched from the door frame to the railing, then looped around the duty board, each piece carefully inspected by DOJ staff to make sure no one could enter or exit without a direct order. Glenwood, on what had seemed like an ordinary afternoon, was frozen in place right before the eyes of those who thought they were untouchable. Lena walked down the hallway, her shoes tapping much more softly than the chaos that had just unfolded. But each step carried the kind of authority that kept everyone silent. Cole was pulled away from the wall, wrists cuffed in front, his face pale enough for the veins in his neck to stand out clearly. Sweat ran down his temple in a long line, as every shout he'd let loose earlier had drained out of him. One agent placed a hand on his shoulder, pushing down to keep him still in the processing line. Cole tried to lift his eyes to look at Lena as she passed, but they trembled, unable to focus. Just hours earlier, he'd been ready to grab her by the hair, pin her face down with his knee. Now, every word caught in his throat. Rourke wasn't ready to accept reality so quickly. When an internal affairs agent stepped into the command room and asked him to step away from his desk and leave all records behind, Rourke slammed his hand down hard enough to sound like thunder. "You don't have the right." His voice roared through the hallway, startling some of the nearby cuffed officers. Rourke took half a step toward the advancing agent, but two DOJ personnel blocked him immediately, gripping his shoulders like wranglers holding back a bull. Glenwood's under our command. We've run this place for 30 years. You can't just barge in and drag people out like that. The DOJ agent didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't react. He just nodded for two other agents to gather every phone, computer, and file from Rourke's desk. One flipped open the laptop and plugged a sealing device into its side port. The click of the lock sounded so sharp it may as well have slapped Rourke across the face. He started to lunge, to grab the laptop back, but he was forced into a chair before he could move. Lena stood near the end of the hallway, watching Rourke writhe as it dawned on him that every game he'd ever won by dominating others was over. She turned to a nearby agent and asked simply, "Detention records?" He nodded and handed her a list. Every name matched those Lena had already reported individuals tied to abuse of power, record tampering, witness intimidation, or falsifying reports to cover up misconduct. Still, Rourke wouldn't quit. He leaned toward Lena, forcing out words like he still had the right to scream in someone's face. "Who the hell do you think you are? Walking in here? What are you in this town that you think you can point fingers at me? You feds always love a show. This isn't your city. 207? Lena turned her head, then stepped back just close enough to be one arm's length from him. Her gaze wasn't sharp like it had been with Cole. It was calm, flat, and steady like water, gone still. "You're right about one thing," she said, pausing so he could hear every word clearly. "Glenwood isn't our city." Rourke smirked, thinking she'd admitted something. But Lena kept speaking, voice low but loud enough to carry down the hall. "But the law is 790s. A young officer in cuffs nearby took a sharp breath. A few others dropped their heads, no longer able to meet Lena's eyes. Rourke's face flushed red, lips trembling into useless sounds. A DOJ agent walked past and lightly pressed a hand to the seal freshly placed on the main door. "Precinct Glenwood is suspended indefinitely. All personnel will remain for questioning." The announcement hit like a hammer, nailing down a coffin lid. That was the last straw for Cole. What little self-control he had left vanished. He jerked his hands back despite the cuffs and blurted out in a broken voice, "No. You guys, you're making this bigger than it is." "I didn't." But nothing else came out. He looked around, searching for someone who might back him up, but saw only federal agents, their stares as heavy as stone. Lena walked slowly toward him, not to intimidate, but to position herself where he had no choice but to face her. His breathing grew shallow, eyes wide. Lena tilted her head slightly, her voice so low and calm that even the ceiling fan behind her seemed to fade. "You said you all decided who was right and who was wrong in Glenwood." She paused, looking straight into him without the slightest tremor. "But now you've seen." She stepped back half a pace, letting the final words fall like a cold blade. "We haven't even used half our authority." Cole stood still, shoulders sagging like his bones had caved in. An agent took hold of him, and he shuffled forward, no longer resisting. The clink of the handcuffs made a small but harsh sound, like the fake power he used to crush others had just shattered in front of him. Lena turned, reaching out to take the coordination board from the FBI team. Glenwood Precinct was no longer operational, and this was only the beginning of what came next. The hallway of the precinct was now filled with federal agents, but through the crowd, a familiar figure stepped forward, making Lena pause for a beat. He wore an old gray baseball cap and a light jacket still dusted with bits of grass from the park. To others, he looked like just another aging city worker, nothing remarkable. But Lena knew that walk too well, the way he always kept his hands in his jacket pockets, and how his eyes missed nothing in the room. "Agent Ridge," he called softly, just loud enough for Lena to hear, unnoticed by anyone else. "You good?" Lena looked at him, exhaling lightly, as if letting go of a weight. "I thought you were still out at the park." "I was," Hale replied, tilting his head slightly. Sat right there on the stone bench by the water station. You walked past 3 times. Never looked. Good job. Held the cover all the way through. Lena understood. Hale was always like that, present and not present at the same time. For months, he'd been the shadow she was never allowed to look at directly, but always within her safety range. Their undercover mission didn't allow face-to-face contact, but Hale had watched her every afternoon from a distance safe enough to avoid suspicion. You were there nearly every day, Lena said. Nearly, Hale nodded. Except for 3 storm days and 2 days I had to report back to the office for task force meetings. Otherwise, I sat right there. Made sure the only people watching you were the ones supposed to. Lena glanced toward the bench at the end of the hallway where Cole had just been taken. You saw everything at the park today. I did, Hale answered plainly. And documented all of it. You kept your composure better than I expected. Lena didn't say anything more. A DOJ agent walked by and handed Hale a sealed file folder. He opened a few pages, eyes dropping in that habitual way, and he read quickly. We cracked the surface layer, Hale said, his voice low and rough like it always carried a quiet burden. But Glenwood runs much deeper than the initial report. Lena stepped closer to avoid being overheard. What did you find? Hale pulled one page from the file. The corner wrinkled as if someone had held onto it as evidence for years. Corruption, falsified records, rewritten incident reports, camera tampering, local business money in exchange for security priority. That's the visible stuff. He turned to another page. His face didn't change, but his voice dropped. The disappearances. Lena narrowed her eyes. How many? Confirmed 8. Likely more than 12, Hale said, handing her a list. Names hastily written in uppercase letters. All of them were people of color, between 18 and 34. All vanished after some encounter with Glenwood PD. Lena read through the names. Faces began to surface in her memory. Stories told by town residents. Stories that had been buried in silence. No one investigated? Some did, Hale replied. But the records vanished. Or got rewritten into something like left town voluntarily. We found 3 files outside the system, which means whoever wrote them didn't trust the command and kept backup copies. Lena took the paper from his hand. All connected to Cole? In part, Hale said. But Cole's not the center. He's just the blade sharpened and put to use. The decision about who to cut came from higher up. Rourke ordered a lot, but someone stands behind him. Lena looked at Hale, her eyes darkening. What are you thinking? Hale paused for a long moment, as if weighing how much she needed to know right now. Then he spoke slowly, each word weighted with care. I think there's another hand in this. A white supremacist group. Its side, not the usual troublemakers, not graffiti crews, not barroom cliques. A type of organization that worked in silence, recruited young members, placed them inside law enforcement, and turned towns like Glenwood into testing grounds for their ideology. Lena set the paper down on a nearby table, her hand clenched tight, a vein standing out. Any markings in the precinct? 2, Hale replied. One in the filing cabinet on the 2nd floor. One under a layer of paint in holding cell number 3. We'll bring in samples for analysis to confirm. But your gut tells you this isn't a coincidence. And the younger officers? Lena asked. 2 are on your side, Hale said, his voice softening slightly. One of them's been helping quietly for a few months now, reporting back to us when the precinct started hiding pocket intel. He won't be investigated. We've already separated his name. End quote. The one at the end of the hallway? Lena looked in that direction. Hale nodded. He said, Glenwood's been holding some secret meetings, the content way off base, and the guy running them always locks the door. No minutes recorded. Lena took a deep breath. So we've just hit the outer layer. Right, Hale said. But the next layer's going to hit back harder. We need to be ready. A federal agent walked by and handed Hale a small device. He glanced at it, then slipped it into his pocket. Tonight, the analysis team's going to comb through every piece of data you sent. And tomorrow, the search warrants will expand to the county level. Lena looked around the precinct, where red tape sealed off every door. Power cords had been pulled from computers, and officers were being led away like witnesses to their own crimes. Glenwood isn't over, Hale said in a low voice. It's only just started to show its true face. Lena nodded slowly. I've been undercover for 11 months. I convery. I know, Hale said. And from now on, you won't be alone. Under the dim white lights, they stood in the building that had once hidden so much rot. But for the first time, the darkness inside had been pulled back and made visible. And what they saw in Glenwood, both of them knew, was only the first layer of something far deeper and far more dangerous. In the hours that followed, Glenwood Precinct no longer looked like a police station. It resembled an excavation site, where layers of rotted power were peeled back in front of those who once believed themselves untouchable. The expanded investigation teams from the DOJ and Internal Affairs brought equipment into every room, opened every drawer, separated file folders, and pulled out documents that had been buried for years. Lena stood at the far end of the hallway, watching the building like she was looking back at the town that had swallowed her childhood. Glenwood had long labeled poor people as a high-risk group, a classification still quietly used by many southern towns. In internal scoring sheets, the poor and people of color were flagged in red, meaning they were more likely to be targeted for patrols, stopped at any time, and easily recorded as non-compliant. The DOJ's analysis team uncovered file sets marked with strange symbols, enough to begin understanding that Glenwood's targeting system was far from accidental. An IA agent called Lena into the main records room, where the stacks of paper looked like they'd waited 10 years to be uncovered. "Ridge, you'll want to see this," he said, handing her a bundle of files clipped together at an off angle. Each page had pencil edits, crossed-out sections, handwritten insertions, and overlapping signatures. These 7 records were blatantly altered. No effort to hide it. They must have believed no one would ever check. Lena flipped through each page, noting an eerie pattern. Every individual cited in these reports came from low-income labor groups. Some were night-shift factory workers, hotel cleaners, or street vendors. The listed offenses were vague. Often things like failure to follow directions or threat to area security, just enough for police to justify temporary detention. And in the notes sections, partially erased lines showed that someone had tried to make adjustments without removing all traces. Lena paused at one particular file where a shaky line of handwriting appeared near the bottom. She frowned. Supplemental documents were added the following day, but there's no verification signature. The agent nodded. This is the part we think Rourke or Cole inserted to legitimize detaining someone they had no grounds to arrest. Lena lifted her head and looked out through the glass, where Rourke still sat at the end of the hall, eyes red like a man who knew his entire empire had just lost its spine. In another corner of the precinct, a group of IA agents was recording testimony from local residents who had just been brought in. They were nervous, voices low, eyes flicking toward the handcuffed Cole every time his name was mentioned. Some had trouble signing their statements, unable to believe that for the first time in years their words were truly being written down. A middle-aged woman leaned on the table with both hands, eyes brimming. He hunted people, picked the ones who wouldn't talk back. He knew who was scared of him. Took them without a reason, and dumped them at the edge of town like trash. The IA agent wrote quickly, trying to keep the story flowing without interruption. An elderly man recounted an incident when Cole and another officer entered the container housing units in the middle of the night, dragged a young man out, slapped him with a charge of disruptive conduct, and took him away. The boy never came back. When she heard that, Lena moved toward the second interview table, where a young man around 20 was holding a pen with trembling hands. "Are you sure that happened in June last year?" the agent asked. The boy nodded firmly. "I remember exactly. His name was Daryl. Lived in unit number 3. Lena stood quietly behind him. The name Daryl rang in her mind like a string pulled tight. She closed her eyes for a second, and the image of a skinny boy from years ago, running circles around her yard, came rushing back. She requested a copy of his file. An old sheet of paper was placed in her hand. The corners already yellowed. The name line was hastily written, with no relative signature because no one in his family even knew he'd been arrested. The charge was vague: obstructing operations. No interrogation time listed. No witnesses. Lena stared at it for a long time, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This family," she said slowly. "I know." Fragments of memory from her childhood came back like water flowing in reverse. The Daryl family had lived in the same building as hers. His mother used to send him over to Lena's place whenever she worked night shifts. Lena remembered clearly how easily he laughed, and how he always hid cookies in his jacket pockets. But Glenwood never allowed kids like him to grow up the right way. And now, his name was on a list of the missing one no one dared to speak about. Hale walked over and saw the paper in Lena's hand. "You recognize it?" "Ah, too well," Lena replied, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Daryl. The family from the West Block. I used to watch him some nights." Hale took a deep breath. "I know this might be hard, but you've got to set the personal stuff aside. We need to stay clear-headed. He's no de divertidos." Lena clenched the file, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "I'm clear-headed, but I'm not letting this name get buried again." She placed the file on the table and glanced at the reports the agents were working through. Glenwood wasn't just a town with a power problem. It was a place where the poor were sorted out, where records were rewritten at the will of the powerful, where the vulnerable were hunted. And no one ever asked why they disappeared. And when Lena looked back at the list of 12 names, she knew this investigation wasn't going to stop inside the precinct. It would spread to every building, every street corner, every person who had chosen silence for years. To her, this was no longer just an assignment. It was an old promise, one Glenwood never imagined she'd return to keep. The night after the raid, Lena returned to the temporary apartment the Bureau had arranged for her at the start of the undercover assignment. The small street behind the residential block was quieter than usual, and the wind squeaked through the metal fence with a strange, grating sound. As she stepped onto the porch, Lena sensed something was off. She bent down and picked up a piece of paper lying right at the edge of the door. A folded sheet. No envelope, no markings. The ink had slightly bled, as if it had been written in haste, but deliberately meant to leave an impact. When she opened it, the message hit immediately blunt and cold. "Stop before you end up buried too." No greeting, no signature, no build-up. One sentence, enough to make someone's hand tremble. Lena folded the paper and set it down on the table near the door. Her face fell into a quiet seriousness, but she showed no sign of fear. She paused for only a moment, as if listening inwardly to see what part of her the writer had hoped to shake. When Lena stepped into the parking lot behind the building, the scene in front of her stopped her cold. Her car had been shifted from its original spot, and both rear windows were shattered with a blunt object. A long, sharp metallic scratch ran across the side of the vehicle, stripping the silver paint into a curled line. The rear left tire was slashed flat against the pavement, visibly misshapen and tilted at an awkward angle. A neighbor stood at a distance, looking from the car at Lena. She approached. "Did you hear anything earlier?" Lena asked. The woman shook her head quickly. No, I didn't see anything. I didn't want to look too long either. The kind of sentence that felt as natural as breath in a town trained to live in silence. Lena crouched to examine the cut in the tire. It was deep, precise, not the work of reckless vandals. Her fingers touched the edge, gently. The style of the slash was familiar. It was the same method Glenwood police had used to disable the cars of people they wanted to warn. A silent signal that the rules had changed, that even with the precinct sealed off, those left behind still wanted to show they hadn't lost. Lena scanned the lot. No one was hiding behind a corner. No one was obviously watching, but she knew this kind of act was never random. The next morning, as the DOJ team prepared to question a key witness named Marvella, who had bravely testified that she once saw Cole push a young man into a car trunk 2 years ago, she didn't show up as scheduled. An agent was sent to check her home. But when they knocked, the house was silent, like it had been empty for days. A bowl of dry cereal still sat on the dining table. The milk never poured in. A spoon had fallen sideways. The back door wasn't forced, but the curtain was askew. Lena walked in, taking in every detail like reading an unwritten story. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," the agent said. Lena looked toward the corner of the room, where Marvella's shoes still sat neatly. "She didn't leave," Lena replied. "She was taken." In the backyard, footprints were pressed into the still drying soil. Lena knelt to examine them. Large size, heavy stance, stride with the precision of someone trained. What made her pause longer was the sole pattern. The rubber grooves at the front matched a type she had seen hundreds of times at the precinct. Standard-issue Glenwood police boots. An IA agent came running. "We checked. These boots were department-issued, not sold to the public." Lena stood, pulling her gloves down slightly. "Which means whoever wore them wasn't afraid to leave evidence, which means they believed someone would clean up after them. It's time Sten." Hale arrived shortly after, a new file folder in hand. He looked at the footprints, the porch, and then at Lena. "We've touched the place they didn't want us to touch." Lena glanced back at the threat note she had received the night before. "They know who I am, and they know the operation isn't over." "Yes," Hale said. "And now, they're striking back." Lena turned toward Marvella's back door. Morning light cut across the kitchen floor, casting a long stripe of brightness. Something in the scene reminded her of Glenwood years ago, when stories of disappearances were just whispers passed around crowded housing blocks. But now, they weren't whispers anymore. They were taking shape by the hour. The team wrapped up the brief search. Lena stepped out to the gate, feeling the cold wind cut across her shoulder. She squinted back at the deepest footprint. Whoever it belonged to had stood at the back door long enough to press it firmly into the earth. Not someone in a hurry, someone watching. "They know your every move," Hale said, almost reading her thoughts. Lena answered slowly, voice low. "And they want to see if I'll back off." Hale looked at her. "Will you?" Lena didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted toward the sealed precinct, where metal doors still bore the marks of the officers who had been taken away. "No," she said. "Glenwood's been running from the truth long enough. It is 11. Beneath her feet, the footprint from the one who left the threat still held firm same tread pattern she'd seen every day for 11 months. Not random, not personal. This was a signal, a reminder that the confrontation had just entered its next chapter, and the other side had decided to stop hiding. The interrogation table sat in the middle of a square, windowless room, a harsh white ceiling light shining directly onto Rourke's face, making the wrinkles around his eyes look deeper than usual. 2 DOJ agents stood in the corner, silently recording every movement. Lena sat across from him, the file open in front of her, hand steady, eyes unblinking. Rourke, once the man who walked as Glenwood belonged to him, now sat with his shoulders hunched, hands cuffed in front of his stomach, his face stiff like dried cement. "We'll start with the financial evidence," the DOJ agent said. "Captain Rourke, an $18,000 transfer from a Houston street business to your secondary account on June 14th. Explain that, and the spares." Rourke turned his head sharply, his voice curt, words forced through clenched teeth like a man with nowhere left to run. "We kept order in this town. The business was just showing appreciation, that's all." Lena didn't respond right away. She flipped the page, pulled out a sheet, and slid it across the table into his line of sight. "Appreciation money that arrives quarterly? On the 14th? For 4 straight years? And during that same period, that business was exempt from safety checks, labor inspections, and even temporary permit reviews." She paused, her voice calm. "That's not keeping order. That's protection." Rourke slammed his hand on the table, the metal of the cuffs clanging sharply. "You don't know this town. We had to do that to keep it from falling apart. People like you show up and leave. But we've lived here all our lives. If we hadn't taken a firm hand, this place would have gone to hell a long time ago." Lena looked at him not with anger, but with a gaze so direct and sharp it seemed to push his words back across the surface. "By stepping on people?" Rourke lifted his face, his attitude a mix of defiance and slipping control. "We dealt with the troublemakers. We knew who should stay and who shouldn't. Glenwood is clean because of us. In the Sailing 7 too." "Glenwood is clean?" Lena repeated, her voice quieter. "The missing aren't trash to be swept away." She opened another folder and placed a photo in front of him. "Explain this." The photo was blurry, but clearly showed a young black girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Face bruised, lips swollen, her t-shirt torn at the shoulder. In the corner of the image, a timestamp read, "December of the previous year." Lena slid a second sheet forward, a handwritten incident report from an old officer. "Victim, Elisa Moore. Assaulted in West Park. Witness reported, a man in police uniform leaving the scene." She pointed to the faded signature at the bottom. "Responding officer, R. Rourke." The room was chilled by a degree. Rourke said nothing. He stared at the photo. His palms clenched so tightly the skin around his wrists turned red. "Do you remember this case?" Lena asked. He swallowed, voice quieter now, but still trying to hold on to defiance. "I was young then. I got dispatched to the scene after it happened. I wasn't involved." "You were," Lena said immediately. "Because this file disappeared from the system 3 days later. No alert, no escalation, no follow-up." The DOJ agent opened another folder, speaking clearly. 3 witnesses brought to the precinct in the 2 weeks after that all changed their statements. 2 moved out of town, 1 disappeared. Rourke's eyes darted, searching for something to hold on to. "That was a long time ago. Those kids were stirring up trouble. We just—" Lena cut in, her voice suddenly cold. "Not all of them were. Just kids. One of them was my distant cousin." Rourke looked at her, eyes widening. Lena placed her hand on the photo, lightly touching the edge. "I was 10 that day. I wasn't there, but I heard her crying when her mother brought her home. And I heard her mother say the police stood by." Stood by. Rourke opened his mouth, but no words came. Lena tilted her head, gaze steady and unwavering. It was the look of someone staring into the face of a man who had caused the wound she'd carried since childhood. "You call that order? I call it by its real name. Tyranny." The DOJ agent placed another key piece of evidence on the table. A torn incident report retrieved from an old box in storage. In faded ink along the edge, a note read, "Investigation halted per orders from above." The person in charge at that time, the one who had just been promoted to lieutenant the year the incident happened, was Rourke. The room grew increasingly quiet, a heavy kind of silence where even the agent's pens scratching against paper could be clearly heard. Rourke breathed hard, his chest rising and falling. "You don't know the pressure here. You don't understand. Kids like him." Lena looked up, her voice dropping so low it was nearly a blade. "And you let that happen?" Rourke's face changed. From anger to defensiveness, then to a tremble, then to the hollow look of a man seeing his own reflection after years of hiding it. An IA agent, standing in the corner of the room, spoke up. "Captain Rourke, we have sufficient evidence linking you to a series of organized criminal activities, including cover-ups, record tampering, and severe civil rights violations. You will be prosecuted on multiple charges, and the Elisa Moore case will be reopened." Rourke lowered his head. His back curled inward, breathing ragged, eyes fixed on the table as if the floor beneath him had given way, right in the very room that once was his stronghold. Lena looked at him for a few seconds, seeing not just the past 11 months but the 12 years before that. Then she stood, gathered the files, and spoke with a calm voice that didn't crack. "You didn't keep order. You kept fear." The interrogation room door opened, and Rourke was led away, still in cuffs. His face no longer bearing a trace of the man who once ran a precinct, only the truth remained, clinging to his shoulders, heavier than any chain. When the case file of the little girl was placed on the meeting table, the room seemed to sink into a silence, thicker than during any previous session. The old report was faded along the edges, its typewritten lines misaligned, interspersed with rushed handwriting. Lena stood at the table, her hand resting on the edge of the document she never thought she'd see again in her life. That case had once been labeled an accident, then quietly buried until no one spoke of it. But now, with the file laid out under harsh white light, the truth came back in layers, like dried mud being scraped off after 12 years. An IA agent presented the matched findings. The victim, a girl named Elisa Moore, was attacked at West Park. Witnesses reported a man in a police uniform leaving the scene. The initial report documented serious injuries, but 2 days later, the case was downgraded to minor incident caused by child play. 3 days after that, the entire file was deleted from the system. He paused, his eyes turning to Lena with understanding. Lena lowered her gaze in a slow blink. "I knew her," she said. "The Moore family lived 1 block from my house. Her mom used to send Elisa over in the afternoons." Hale stood beside her, arms crossed. "Are you sure you want to listen to the witness recording yourself? It might hit hard." "This is something I have to face," Lena replied. She didn't raise her voice, but her tone was so firm that no one considered arguing. The agent played a short recording, found on an old cassette tape, that a retired officer had kept in secret. A child's choked crying echoed faintly, broken and small. Then the voice of an older woman came through, desperate and trembling so badly her words collided. "She said a policeman." She ran, but he grabbed her. "I called right away, but they said I was mistaken. Then they told me to stay quiet if I wanted to stay safe." Lena closed her eyes, but didn't turn away. That cry pulled her back to when she was 10, to the day Elisa sat on her porch steps, knees scraped, eyes red and speechless. Lena hadn't understood it then, only that the adults said, "Don't ask again." Glenwood had always handled things the same way. Silence, heavy as a thick blanket, thrown over every question. Poor families didn't fight back. Witnesses were threatened. And girls like Elisa grew up with wounds no one ever tried to heal. Lena opened her eyes and stared at the photo in the file. Elisa never went back to that park. I remember her mom had to get a job in another town just to avoid the police here. Hale nodded. The Southeast community was silenced for so long they stopped believing they had a right to speak. Another agent brought in a list of families who had filed complaints that year. 8 in total, each marked resolved. Yet none had an investigation report attached. 4 families moved away within 2 months. 2 families could no longer be located. They were threatened, Lena said. I remember the neighborhood buzzing for a few weeks, but then everyone stopped saying her name. Like the child never existed. Hale turned to the final page, a note written by a medic from the ambulance crew that day. Observation. Young girl in shock, shoved hard onto concrete. When asked who did it, she shook her head and said, "The man in blue." We weren't allowed to ask further. Got a directive to let police handle it. That last line froze Lena in place. During her undercover months, she'd grown used to Glenwood's excuses, to Cole's talk of keeping order, to how Rourke treated the poor like a burden to be cleared. But this wasn't part of their act. This was a real fracture cut deep by a child she once knew, once shared cookies with, once heard laughing in her front yard. She stepped back half a pace, resting her hand on the edge of the table, her shoulders dipping slightly. For the first time since the precinct was shut down, a small tremble passed through Lena's expression. Not weakness, but a wave of pain from the past, breaking through stronger than she had braced for. Hale saw it, started to step forward, then stopped. He knew this kind of silence wasn't to be interrupted. It was something Lena had to allow herself to feel, after 11 months of wearing a careful mask. "Do you want to step out for a few minutes?" Hale asked gently. Lena shook her head. "No. I need to hear it all." She pulled out a chair and sat down again. Her hands were folded together on the table. The overhead light cast sharp shadows, like the file's trail was narrowing toward those truly responsible. "What's left in the system on the Elisa Moore case?" Lena asked. The IA agent replied, "Just the photo, 3 notes, and 2 statements that were erased. But outside the system, there's one witness who never left Glenwood. She used to work with Elisa's mother at the Southeast Church. I want to speak with her," Lena said. Hale placed a hand on her shoulder for 1 second. A quiet reminder that the road ahead wouldn't get easier. But Lena's eyes had already settled into the steady look they knew well. The truth could be buried for years, but once the earth was pushed aside, it always rose back stronger. In that moment, Lena understood why she'd been chosen for this case, not just for her skills. Glenwood had marked her life long ago. And now, that past was no longer a shadow. It had become part of the next testimony, the next arrest warrant, the next truth the town would have to hear whether it wanted to or not. The night before the trial, Glenwood was no longer as restless as it had been in recent days. The streets were still lit as usual, but beneath that quiet layer were subtle movements Lena saw more clearly than anyone else. As she stepped out of the federal building, a few townspeople stood at a distance. No one came close, but their eyes followed her. An old woman pushing a candy cart paused and gave a slight nod as Lena passed. A young man placed a paper bag on the steps and left, before she could ask anything. Inside the bag was just a bottle of water and a note with a single line. "Thank you." No one ever dared to do this. Simple actions, but heavy with meaning. Because these people had spent their lives bowing under the force that held them down. Lena didn't approach them, nor did she offer a polite smile. She understood they weren't trying to show support publicly. They just wanted to survive after the trial, and they didn't want their names in any report. The silence of Glenwood's community this time wasn't fear. It was their way of standing on the right side. They let her pass like a signal, wordless, but unmistakably clear. In the interrogation room near the holding cells, Cole sat hunched forward, his cuffed hands resting on the metal table. The aggression was gone from him, leaving only a tiredness spreading across his face. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, and his collar loose, like someone who no longer had the strength to keep up appearances. When Lena entered with 2 agents, Cole looked up immediately, his voice catching, "Let me speak with you alone." "Just 5 minutes." The DOJ agent glanced at Lena. She gave a small nod. They stepped back a few paces, standing by the door but not leaving the room. Cole swallowed hard, his back slightly bent, his voice stripped of the authority that used to instill fear. "Lena, Agent Ridge, you know how far they pushed me. You could ease your statement. Or at least say, I didn't mean to." Lena sat down, placing both hands calmly on the table. "You mean a deal?" Cole nodded quickly. "I'll cooperate. I'll tell everything. Anything you need. I know who they're connected to, who in town paid, who signed off on the records. You want names? I'll give names." "In exchange for what?" Lena asked. Cole exhaled hard, his hands trembling in the cuffs. "In exchange for not being locked up for life. I don't want to die in prison. He stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Lena looked at him not with anger, but with the clear truth. He was afraid. Not of justice, but of the power that once protected him, was stripped away in a single afternoon. "Cole," Lena said slowly, "you're not being honest. If you really wanted to cooperate, you would have done it last month. Or last year. Or 10 years ago. When the people you arrested disappeared from the records." Cole opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Lena continued, "You're not asking for a deal to help the investigation. You're asking to save yourself." He looked down at the table, as if the words hit the exact wound he'd been hiding. I just want to live. I'm not like Rourke. I didn't. Izuz. You're the one who pinned my face to the ground in the park," Lena said, her voice low enough that no emphasis was needed for Cole to slump. "You're the one who threatened to fake reports, who smashed people's cars, who forced civilians into silence. You're not a victim." Cole's hands shook. "Please, any deal. I'll help you." Lena stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "Your statement will be recorded, but there will be no deal." End quote. He lurched to his feet, but the cuffs kept him from going far. "You want me to die in prison?" Lena looked straight at him, her eyes unflinching. "I want the truth to come out. Whatever consequences you face are from choices you made years ago." The two agents stepped forward to take Cole back to his cell. He shouted after her, voice cracking, "Lena! You don't know what they're like. They'll take you down with them." But his shout was cut off the moment the iron door closed. Afterward, Lena entered the temporary office of the federal team. Hale was there, leaning on the desk, an open file in front of him. He looked at her and asked quietly, "You okay?" Lena sat down, rubbing her fingertips lightly. "He asked for a deal. I figured he would," Hale replied. "But tomorrow is the turning point. This isn't just about one precinct anymore. The whole county will be watching the trial. Be ready." Lena nodded. "I know. Of Unite." She opened her laptop and began to write her statement. No dramatics, no language to dress the story up. Just the bare truth, line by line, the way she'd lived her 11 months in Glenwood. Quietly observing, remembering every detail, waiting for this day to come. She wrote about that afternoon under the harsh sun, about Cole's hand gripping her hair, his knee pressed to her face, the insults, the averted eyes of the townspeople. She didn't write in anger, but with the precision of someone who knew her words would shape the future of an entire town. The night stretched long but didn't feel heavy. When she stopped typing, Hale looked at the document on the screen and said, "You wrote it well. Don't add or cut anything." Lena looked out the window, where streetlights cast long tree shadows across the ground. "Tomorrow," she said, "they'll have to hear the truth, whether they want to or not." Hale nodded. "And after that, Glenwood won't be the same." In the quiet of the night, that was both a promise and a warning for what waited with the coming morning. The federal courtroom that morning was packed early. No shouting, no protests, no loud whispers, but the air was thick, like steam before a storm. Glenwood residents sat scattered across the benches, many of the same faces that once lowered their eyes at the sight of police, now looking straight at the bench. Cole was brought in first, handcuffed, shoulders slumped. He looked around like a man lost in a room he used to know, now filled with eyes that no longer feared him. Rourke came in afterward, his face stiff, eyes downcast, with none of the authority of the man who once ruled the town. Lena sat in the witness section, back straight, both hands resting lightly on her knees. Hale stood behind her with the federal team, silent, but his presence was enough to steady the entire room. When the judge gave the signal, the prosecutor stepped forward and placed a hard drive on the evidence stand. "We will begin with video evidence." The back rows grew quieter. A few townspeople folded their hands together. The large screen flickered on, casting light across the room. The first image was Glenwood Park at midday. Lena, in a green uniform, was trimming branches, sunlight glaring down on her shoulders. Cole entered from a distance, swaggering, hands on his hips like he owned the ground beneath him. He walked up and barked, his voice loud through the speaker. "Hey, green shirt girl! Who the hell said you could come near this area?" A few people in the courtroom bowed their heads, as if hearing again the thing they had always been afraid of. The video continued. Cole knocked Lena's tools to the ground, shoved her shoulder, then bent down close to her face like a predator. The stream of insults followed, each word clear enough that no one could escape the tightening in their chest. Then came the moment Lena bent down to pick up her shears, and Cole yanked her hair back, slamming her to the grass. When his knee pressed down on her face, the courtroom went completely still. The click of someone's pen from the back row could be heard clearly. A woman put her hand to her mouth, choking on a breath as Cole snarled, "You people better be thankful I didn't smash your face in." An elderly man stood up halfway, then sat back down, slowly shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The video kept playing Lena's labored breathing, her wrists being cuffed, her body dragged like an object with no owner. No one spoke, no one coughed, no one moved. It was like the entire room was holding the same breath. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned off the screen. "This," he said, "is the behavior of someone entrusted to protect the public. It's a." The judge looked at Cole. "Do you have anything to say?" Cole shot up, legs shaking, the cuffs on his wrists clinking softly. I didn't mean to. I just—" His voice cracked, falling apart. "I was under pressure. I was handling the situation." But nothing he said sounded honest, and no one in the room believed him. Cole spoke like a man watching a wall collapse in front of him, still trying to brush away bricks to find somewhere to hide. "That's enough," the judge said. No need to raise his voice. Lena was called to the stand. She stood straight, hand on the microphone, her eyes not on Cole, but on the judge, the jury, and the town of Glenwood, sitting inside that room. They saw me as weak, as easy to silence, as someone they could pin to the ground, and no one would care. She took a slow breath, but they were wrong. I was there to gather the truth, not to endure it. Oof. The room stayed silent, but it was a silence of weight, of something heavy laid bare in the center of the floor. No grand speech, no dramatic lines, just truth, solid as stone. Lena continued, recounting every detail. The insults, the pressure of his knee, the way they cuffed her, the way they altered the report. She added no emotion to her voice, but it was that calm, steady delivery that made everyone feel the full brutality of what Cole and his team had done. As she stepped down, the judge was about to move on to the next part, when a young voice rose from the audience. "Excuse me, I'd like to give an additional statement." Everyone turned. A young officer stood up. He was the one Lena had seen at the end of the hallway during the raid, the one who had quietly smiled at her. Lena's heart paused, not out of worry, but because she knew what he was about to do would change his life forever. The judge gestured. "What's your name?" "Officer Daniel Brooks," he replied, his voice shaky but his gaze steady. "I want to testify about the internal network inside the precinct." The courtroom stirred. Former officers turned sharply. Some immediately looked down, their shoulders shrinking. Daniel stepped up to the witness stand, his hand clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. "I know what Cole did," Daniel said. "I know Rourke protected him. I know they had a list of targets to handle. I saw the secret meetings. I saw the files being torn up. And I stayed silent for too long." His voice cracked on the last line, but he didn't cry. He stood like someone who had finally broken the rope that had been tightening around his neck for years. "I'm standing up today because I don't want Glenwood to be a place where the police hunt their own people." A woman in the front row began to cry. Someone placed a hand on his shoulder. The judge looked at him longer than usual, then nodded. "Your statement will be entered into the record." Lena looked at Daniel, her gaze quiet but warm. He glanced her way and gave a small nod, this time not a hidden signal, but a real choice made by someone who wanted to do the right thing. The trial went on. But from that moment, everyone in the room knew the balance had shifted. Not just because of the video, not just because of Lena's testimony, but because someone from within the system had stood up and said, "Enough." And Glenwood, for the first time in decades, truly heard it. The verdict was delivered in the afternoon, with the last light of day slanting through the large courtroom window behind the judge. The courtroom was packed, but the silence was so complete that the slow spin of the ceiling fan could be heard. Cole stood before the bench, hands cuffed in front of him, eyes sunken like someone who hadn't slept for many nights. As the judge read the sentence, he didn't look up, didn't protest, and no longer had the strength to deny what had been made undeniable through every minute of the trial. 26 years in prison without parole. One sentence, and it ended the voice of a man who used to yell into people's faces every single day. Cole leaned slightly backward, as if the last part of the sentence had knocked him off balance. But the agent beside him held him steady. No one in the room cheered, no banging of fists, no flash of celebration. The decision was met with silence, the silence of a community that had waited far too long to see the powerful finally pay. Rourke was brought up right after Cole. He still wore his usual hardened look, chin tilted slightly upward, as if trying to show he hadn't been broken. But as the prosecutor listed more than 10 charges, abuse of power, record tampering, accepting illicit payments, witness intimidation, shielding criminal activity, obstruction of a federal investigation, his shoulders sank a little more with each word. These were not the kind of accusations that could be brushed off with, "I did it for the town." When the judge delivered the combined sentence, a sentence long enough to bury both his ambition and his reputation, Rourke stopped tilting, his chin. He stared down at the floor like it was the first time in his life he realized it didn't belong to him. The people of Glenwood watched with a mix of emotions. Some clenched their jaws, some had tears in their eyes, some sat motionless. Pain mixed with relief, because what they had endured came not from one man or two, but from a whole system that had pressed down on them for years. When the judge signed the final ruling, a court officer read aloud, "The Glenwood precinct will be placed under federal oversight for a minimum of 5 years. All staffing decisions, detainment procedures, and patrol operations will be under special review." That sentence made several people in the room exhale deeply, like a breath held in for too long. This wasn't the end, but it was the first real shift, something they had never dared to believe they would witness. Hale stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Lena. He looked at her like a man who understood this moment wasn't joyful. It was a rare exhale after months of weight pressing down. Lena remained seated in the witness row, shoulders straight, expression unreadable. Throughout the sentencing, She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't show a single flicker of triumph. As Cole was escorted out, his eyes accidentally met hers. There was no more hatred, no more rage, only emptiness. The look of someone who finally understood that all the power he thought he had was just a trap he had walked into himself. Lena looked at him for 1 second, not with cruelty, not with forgiveness. Just the look of someone who had witnessed every step that led to this end. As the courtroom began to empty, groups of people quietly made their way out. A young mother hugged her son tightly and whispered, "Today is the day the town changed." An old man with a cane approached Lena, not too close, gave her a slow nod, then turned away. The words they didn't say spoke louder than any thank you. Hale walked up beside Lena and asked quietly, "You okay?" Lena gently brushed the edge of the notepad she had held since the start of the session. "Okay? In the way I need to be?" she replied. No burst of happiness, no satisfaction, just the strange feeling of finally letting go of a stone she had carried for far too long. The two of them stepped outside the courthouse. The late afternoon sun wasn't as harsh as it had been that day in the park, but bright enough that Lena closed her eyes for a moment. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Not a victorious sigh, but the release of the heaviest part of a long descent. On the courthouse steps, the wind swept by, carrying the dusty scent of Glenwood, a town that had once choked the breath out of many, now learning how to breathe again. Lena imagined the ceiling tape still strung across the precinct's doors, then looked at the townspeople walking away from the courthouse, each step a little lighter than when they had arrived. Hale placed a hand on her shoulder for a moment. "You did it." Lena looked toward the road that led away from the town center, her voice quiet, like she was speaking only to herself. "This isn't a victory. It's balance, in a David." And in that moment, as the light faded and the crowd dispersed, one thing was clear. Glenwood would never return to what it had been. And Lena, even without celebration, could finally breathe like someone stepping out of a dark room and realizing they still had the strength to keep walking. When Lena left the federal courthouse, the parking lot was nearly empty. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only a few scattered cars under the fading afternoon light. Wind swept across the asphalt, carrying the warmth left by a long day. Lena walked toward her car, about to open the door when she suddenly stopped. Tucked beneath the windshield wiper was a black envelope, pressed flat against the glass, its edge slightly curled, as if someone had placed it in a hurry and left right away. No sender name, no markings, just a solid black, thick as charcoal in the dying light. Lena reached for the envelope, feeling its surface oddly cold. She opened it right there, the soft glow of evening casting light on what was inside. A photo slid into her hand. She caught it by reflex, then froze for a few seconds. In the photo was a young black girl, her face bruised, lips swollen, eyes wide with fear, exactly like Elisa once was. But the background wasn't Glenwood. A blurry sign in the corner showed the name of another town, Jasper Creek. Behind the photo, a small piece of paper was tucked in. Just one sentence, written in black ink, with neat, cold strokes. This story started long before you arrived. The evening wind stirred the paper gently between Lena's fingers. She looked at the words again, then glanced around the lot. No one was waiting. No one was watching, at least. Not obviously, but Lena could feel it. Something larger than Glenwood. Larger than Cole. Larger than Rourke. A hand pulling the strings behind the disappearances, the beatings, a filthy system that didn't end at the borders of this small town. Hale came out of the courthouse just then. Seeing her standing still, he walked over. "Something wrong?" he asked. Lena handed him the photo. Hale studied it for a moment, his face growing grim. "Jasper Creek," he said quietly. "I've heard about that town. Not much better than Glenwood." Lena folded the envelope, her voice steady. Someone wants to remind me that what happened here is just the surface. Hale sighed, though he didn't look surprised. You clear one dark corner, and the next one lights up. Whoever sent this knows you won't walk away. Lena looked toward the sky, where the orange-gold light was fading, leaving a pale blue stretch over the horizon. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't restless. She simply knew deep in her bones that whatever door had just opened led to a journey far longer than the 11 months she had already lived through. She slid the envelope into her coat pocket, then walked around her car, checking quickly out of habit. The habit of someone who'd been in deep cover long enough to understand where safety ends. No traps. No footprints, like last time. Just silence. Waiting. Hale stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his voice quieter. You don't have to take this one. You've done more than enough for Glenwood. Lena looked at him, her eyes not sharp like they were in court, but calm and sure. I know. But I also know this doesn't stop here. If someone sent that envelope, it means they think I'll keep going. And will you? Hale asked. Lena opened her car door, resting her hand on the frame, then looked down the long road ahead, now sinking into dusk. I will, she said, because if even one more child ends up like that, I can't look away. Hale didn't try to stop her. He only nodded, like someone who understood that the fire in her couldn't be put out by a single verdict. Lena pulled out of the lot, the black envelope tucked firmly in her pocket. Every step she took was light but certain, like someone who had accepted the path now unfolding, with all its darkness and all its silent screams hidden underneath. The last wind of the day swept through, brushing her coat sleeve like a whisper from stories still untold. And Lena walked on, not like someone who had just won a case, but like the first spark in a larger fight, still waiting for her ahead.